Good morning, Sarah Burrows, and thank you for talking to me today. Could you please introduce yourself and tell me a little about your work at CAFOD?
Yeah, of course. Good morning, Anne-Marie. So my name is Sarah. I work for CAFOD in the emergency response team, and I focus on our Syria crisis response. CAFOD is an international development agency and part of the Catholic Church in England and Wales. We work globally with all people of all faiths and no faith, and we're one of the largest aid and development networks in the world. And we do long-term development work as well as respond to emergencies, and we also work for justice and campaign so that every person can live a dignified life.
Thank you. Sarah, would you mind telling me how you fund your partners in Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan?
Yes, of course. So in Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan, which is where our Syria crisis response program is currently, where we're currently supporting partners in those three countries at the moment. And we fund our partners based on a number of criteria. Essentially, it's based on needs. So what are the greatest needs? Where are those needs? And how can we support our partners in responding to those needs? That might be, it depends on the situation really. So for example, a few months ago, there were storms in camps in northwest Syria where thousands of internally displaced people live, and the storms meant that people's tents and the camps were flooded. And so those needs meant that people needed support clearing up the damage, as well as food and shelter. They were the needs that were identified in that situation. But it's also about ensuring that we're reaching the most vulnerable. So for CAFOD's work, this is really important, making sure that there's an option for the poorest and we're reaching the most vulnerable people. And for us in our program, this is often women, children, people with disabilities, the elderly. And so it's also about, as well as the needs and based on situation, and we're also making sure that we're trying to reach the most vulnerable. And I think the last thing that we take, or another factor that we take into account, is coordination, making sure that we're speaking with and coordinating with other actors on the ground locally to ensure that there's no gaps or duplication. So if one charity in the region is responding to an emergency situation with distributions of mattresses, for example, during winter, then it might be that we look at the needs and see that there's a gap, that nobody is responding with food packages, so that kind of thing. So it's also about coordination as well.
And what happens, for example, if there are two different emergencies and you have limited funding? How do you all decide which one is more important or which one is more crucial?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it can be quite a difficult one in some instances. But we take into account those criteria again, making sure that where are the needs higher, if that can be decided. What are local actors saying about the situation on the ground? So often they'll release reports and do needs assessments to say that at the moment these are the priority needs for this group of people, and so that helps informs our decision and which projects we support. It's also in conversation with our partners. They're the ones, they're locally based, they're the experts on the ground, they know the area and the situation better than we do. So it's making sure that we're listening to our partners and asking them the question, where do you feel the needs are greatest? And also, do you have funding elsewhere to support some of these other projects? And that helps us kind of identify the gaps and decide which projects we fund. And also projects that are in line with our, excuse me, that are in line with our strategy for the Syria crisis program as well.
And now, for example, education is an emergency if you look at it from one point of view, but it requires long-term planning and funding. So, for example, now in the pandemic, there's a huge amount of pressure on funds for medicine and
Mhm.
other health concerns. How does that affect funding for education? What happens, do you say that, okay, fine, we do not have sufficient funds for educational projects, or how do you all balance that?
Yeah, it's been a difficult one. I think last year when the pandemic really started to hit the countries where we were responding, um, it was clear that there was a need to respond additionally to the projects that were already happening. So kind of COVID-19 specific response. But we'd already committed to those maybe longer term projects, including education, but also healthcare and livelihoods. And so we'd already committed to our partners those grants, and we're not going to, suddenly change our mind and pull out of those agreements. So we wanted to ensure that we could carry on supporting those projects, including education projects. And then at CAFOD, we did a bit of a reshuffle. We kind of, our funding globally was affected. So we had to repurpose a lot of our grants to enable a rapid release of funds to respond specifically to COVID last year. But we carried on supporting those longer term, including educational projects. I think the problem will be more going forwards. More generally, our funding has been affected by the pandemic. We've all been impacted. Everyone has been impacted by this situation. And so communities in the UK who support our work have also been impacted financially by this pandemic, as well as some of the trusts and foundations and institutional funding sources that they've also been looking at their own budgets and scaling back to try and make their own savings. So this all has a knock-on effect, unfortunately, which does impact our partners' work. So I think really the impact will be seen in the longer term. However, having said that, the generosity of the communities in England and Wales has been amazing to support our COVID-19 appeal. And there's also been other sources of funding that we've been able to access because of the pandemic that have supported the more kind of newer emergency response COVID projects, and has meant that we've been able to continue supporting our partners with the education projects and other health, livelihoods kind of projects as well.
In the field of education, is there a shortfall because now it's not face-to-face education anymore? It is virtual, and in some cases it's a hybrid model. So there's a lot more expense with regards to accessing computers, internet facilities. So a lot more funding is required. So is there a lot more pressure? Is there a need to generate more funding? Otherwise, there is going to be a shortfall in terms of these projects.
Yeah, I mean, there's always a shortfall because the needs, because of the Syria crisis, are so high, and unfortunately they're getting higher. Therefore, there's always going to be a shortfall of funding. We could always do more. Our partners could always, they're working completely maximum capacity, and they're doing an amazing job. But there's always going to be a shortfall of funding, and there's always going to be more people that we could reach. I think one of the things we've seen in Jordan, where we're supporting an inclusive education project there, is a need to, given the amount of lockdown restrictions and the impacts of the pandemic more broadly, and schools closing and then reopening again, there's been this shift from delivering face-to-face lessons. So often it'll be the local host community, so in this instance, the local Jordanian children in the morning, and then there'll be an extra shift in the afternoon to support the Syrian refugee children in the afternoon. But there's been this shift in the way that those lessons are delivered. And so many of them are now delivered online, remotely, or as you said, a bit of a hybrid. And so, there's different needs there in terms of funding. There's a need for sometimes internet cards for families who need to support their children with online learning to make sure that they've got internet access and can afford that. internet top-up cards, as well as some of the equipment that's needed. So one of our partners in Lebanon, we're funding a partner who is delivering English classes and IT lessons and coding, and they've needed to invest in some new equipment, some laptops. And so, yeah, that's had to be part of some of the things that we consider when we're designing the projects or when our partners are designing the projects. So, yeah, some of the needs have had to change slightly, and funding has had to be, repurposed and used in a slightly different way to kind of adapt to the situation as it changes.
And now, with regards to the pandemic affecting funding, how has the devaluing of the currency in Lebanon affected the inflow of funding into the country?
Yeah, it's been quite a difficult one. I think first and foremost, it's affected the people most. It's affecting the humanitarian situation on the ground. But yeah, it definitely affects the funding situation as well. In Lebanon, is going through a severe economic crisis, unprecedented inflation prices. And so there's high rates of unemployment and poverty. There's been problems with the banks, where if people have had money in the banks already, those accounts have been frozen almost, and people cannot withdraw that money, and they've essentially lost it. For our work, it's slightly different because they call it fresh dollars or fresh money. So because it's kind of new and fresh money that's coming into the country, in most cases, our partners are able to access that. Many partners have had to negotiate with the banks to be able to withdraw that, explain that this is for, humanitarian and development work. And yeah, I've had to come up with agreements with the banks or even set up new bank accounts. But they've managed to find solutions to the many banking and financial problems that the country has faced over the past 18 months or so. And Syria is the same. Syria is also going through an economic crisis where the value of the Syrian pound has dropped to record lows. And the economic crisis in Lebanon also affects the situation in Syria because the banks are tied up in Lebanon. So this, just has a huge knock-on effect on people and the needs on the ground. But it has been a bit of a headache in terms of the financial implications and navigating the banking system, and how to ensure that we can reach the most people with the same amount of money that's maybe now worth less because of the devalue. So there's been a lot of problem solving that our partners have had to think through over the past year or two.
And in terms of y'all looking at the marginalized and the vulnerable in those communities, again, even with regards to, say, just the educational needs, it's these communities that kind of get pushed out. And when integrated communities are already facing a terrible crisis, it's these communities who get further pushed out, and it becomes even more difficult to look after them, to provide them help and other facilities.
Yeah, definitely. I think this pandemic has been, it's really shown us the deep inequalities in the system globally. And unfortunately, as always, it seems to be the poorest, the most vulnerable communities that are impacted the most. And so, it's a really bad situation in the region at the moment, because even before the pandemic, the situation wasn't great. We were coming up to 10 years of the Syria crisis and all the impacts that has. We also had the economic crisis. There was, the Beirut explosion as well last year in Lebanon. There was multiple crises happening inside Syria, whether that was floods or storms or more conflict. And so all that situation was already pretty dire. And then on top of that, there's been the impact of the COVID pandemic. So it's really not been easy for the many people that have been affected.
And it's as you said, it's been 10 years. So with regards to the media, they've been covering the crisis for so long, and you hear very little or maybe nothing about what is happening in the region at the moment, because the media is kind of now busy with crises that have just come up, or say the COVID-19 pandemic, and the people need a voice, but there's nothing much being said about what is actually happening on the ground in Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan, and the other parts of the region.
Yeah, no, you're right. I think it's been quite difficult to kind of share those stories, given that the the media landscape, certainly in the UK, has been quite saturated with COVID-19, but COVID specifically in the UK. And that's, in part, that's understandable, given that this is a situation that's really close to home and has had a terrible, devastating impact on our own communities here in the UK. But it's just such a shame that we're only seeing such a small part of the picture. And I think it's really important that we are informed and kept aware of what's happening in the region, given that the needs are so great. And it's really important that we don't forget the people of Syria, and also host communities that are supporting so many Syrians. I've got some really wonderful colleagues who do some great media and comms work to try and share some of those stories. And they've shared with me how it's actually been really difficult to get some of those stories out. There are moments of opportunity, like the 10-year anniversary back in March of this year, where there was a bit more pickup from the UK media. So some of those stories were a bit easier to share. Or in June, there's World Refugee Day, and we'll try again to share some more of those stories. So there's kind of key moments that are real opportunities for us. But other than that, it is, yeah, you're right, it's really difficult to kind of hear or read much in the news. I guess as well, just 10 years in, I kind of get a sense that some people might be maybe tired of hearing about Syria or switch off a little bit. But again, it's just so important that we stay tuned into it and keep aware of what's happening.
And also in terms of aid for Syria and the other parts of the region, we're seeing a lot of governments saying, okay, fine, we're not going to give you all as much, and reducing that amount. That must be having an effect on the work that you all do, or is it not, doesn't concern you all to a certain extent? What happens?
Yeah, the cuts in the foreign aid budget have been really disappointing. In the midst of a global pandemic, when, as I just said, it's the poorest communities that are impacted the most, this is when the foreign aid budget is needed. It's now more than ever. And I think people are saying that the pandemic has thrown poverty levels way back and set us back 10 or so years back in terms of the progress that's been made. And I think it's really sad. It's a real shame that as the UK is the fifth largest economy in the world, for us to cut back on this commitment to support less wealthy nations, I think it's really shocking, and it's definitely going to have an impact. It means that children won't be able to go to school. It means that health clinics will have to close. It means that the vaccination rollout elsewhere will be slower. And yeah, the foreign aid budget is a case of saving lives, and I think the lives will be lost as a result of this, and so many more people who are living in poverty or extreme poverty will not be supported as a result of this. So I think it's a real shame, and we've been doing a lot of campaigning and advocacy work to try and on the back of the decisions that have been shared, we've kind of really, really disappointed in it, especially when this pandemic has taught us that with this one global family, we have this moral responsibility towards each other. And I think to turn our back on our global sisters and brothers in a time like this, when we're all in crisis, I think it's really sad.
And to put a point forward, if you look at just the UK, if you look at the current budget, there's so much being given for defense. We don't really need that much. Our country is not going to war in a hurry,
No.
and the pandemic is a more urgent need. We've seen with our own NHS, they haven't appreciated them at all.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think, I'm not saying that there are not needs in this country. Like there's so much poverty in the UK, and the crisis, as I said earlier, has really impacted us severely in the UK, and that needs to be addressed. But I think it's a kind of false choice that we're presented with. Like people say, oh, charity starts at home, and I fully agree with that. Like charity does start at home, but it should not end at home. It needs to go beyond ourselves, and it's a false choice to think that we have to choose between either supporting people in this country or supporting people in other countries, given that, like you said, it's such a small percent of our budget.
Yeah.
And like the fact that we're giving so much to defense and arms, and I think it's crazy.
No, and it's not about cutting back on what we have. It's just about sharing what we have, and I'm sure that the UK's budget has enough to accommodate more charitable funding. It's not that we are saying, okay, fine, we are going to go without, and therefore we will give them. We have enough for both home as well as foreign aid.
Yeah, I think so. I guess it's also the way that that's presented. It's the way that that's communicated to people that maybe sometimes there's a misunderstanding about that, either a misunderstanding about the importance of the aid budget, or a misunderstanding about the figures, or even the impacts, the effect that they have. So again, like you said, the media has got a big role to play.
Thank you, Sarah, for talking to me today and telling me about how you work with your partners in Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
You're welcome. Have a nice day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye, Marie.